Rabbi Abraham Cooper is Associate Dean and Director of the Global Social Action Agenda for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, an organization he helped found along with Rabbi Marvin Hier. He is active defending the rights of the Jewish people, combating terrorism, and promoting multi-faith relations worldwide. He works with Gulf Arab leaders and attended the UAE Bahrain-Israel Accord ceremony at the White House. Newsweek, Daily Beast lists Rabbi Cooper, along with Rabbi Hier, in the top 10 of the 50 most influential rabbis in the United States. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Ann. It's a pleasure to be with you, even though we're talking about one of the most painful topics and experiences that you and I and other Jewish leaders experienced back in 2000. So thank you for the opportunity to take time to reflect on the Durban debacle. And unfortunately, 20 years later, because of the machinations of many of the same forces, we now have to fight against the Durban 4. Looking back in 2000, we were already struggling with the Intifada. Jews in France had a brand new phenomenon of the firebombing of synagogues in the ring surrounding Paris. In some cases, synagogues were attacked, same synagogue was attacked more than once. So the violent anti-Semitism that was also targeting our institutions was resurgent. Now, as far as the Wiesenthal Center, and I can't speak for other groups, but I imagine it's not a whole lot different. We were so excited about the idea of a world conference against racism that we bring together over 3,500 NGOs that would enable people like myself to interact with human rights activists from all over the world, including Asia, Dalits, indigenous people from the Americas, you name it. Everyone who could show up did in fact show up, and we were quite excited to have that opportunity, also knowing that there would be somewhere in the vicinity of 1,500 media converging on Durban, South Africa. This and more. In the year 2000, Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of the UN, an African. We had Colin Powell, an African American, who's the Secretary of State of the United States. And the notion of coming, or you might say even rewarding, the post-apartheid South Africa as the venue for the first major UN conference of that sort on the African continent, you would think would be an amazing convergence that would bring someone like a Colin Powell to participate and head up the US delegation. That was not to be. The United States and a number of other countries, but particularly the US, was furious that as they understood things were heading towards Durban, that the issue of reparations for slavery in the United States was going to be near the top of the issues debated by the NGOs and then presented in the final document to the governments. That was something that the US would have nothing to do with. At the same time, and I think to his historic credit, my colleague, Dr. Shimon Samuels, took the time, effort on behalf of the Wiesenthal Center, and turns out the larger Jewish concerns. We were members of ECOSOC at the UN, and that means that we had access to what are called prepcoms, advanced meetings, where you have some idea of what's going to actually take place during the conference. I know there was one in Warsaw. He schlepped to South America, but the prize that we were most interested in was the last meeting. And of course, where would that be held if you were talking about anti-racism? Tehran, Iran. And throughout this process, Mary Robinson, who was in charge of Durban, and I think many observers thought this would be a stepping stone for her to become the Secretary General of the United Nations, former president of Ireland, amazing name recognition worldwide. She kept assuring us, no, you guys will be able to attend Tehran as well. Well, as it happened, we weren't. Shimon protested directly to Mary Robinson. And lo and behold, as soon as the last flight from a European capital like Paris left for Tehran, we received under the door an invitation to participate. So we saw that not only in terms of that shtick, but what was coming down the road, we anticipated that we would have some problems. I don't think anyone anticipated what it was that we actually going to experience at Durban. So as briefly as I can, it turned out not to be a human rights meeting. It turned out to be an ambush of the Jewish people, a slander of Zionism and Israel, and orchestrated and perpetrated by the guardians of civil society, 3,500 NGOs, a lot of the big players, the main players. I'm sure you'll be hearing from other experts and speakers, groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. They basically were either nowhere to be seen or complicit with what was evolving. And what was the goal of this conference, well, of the hijackers? It was to memorialize the term apartheid in the country in which apartheid was created and was overcome by nonviolent means, and then apply it in the 21st century, the new 21st century, graft it onto the Jewish state of Israel. Horrific goal, a cynical game plan, one of which, of course, we're still fighting. Secondly, was to decouple the concepts or the concerns over anti-Semitism from any of the anti-racism activities of and rules and laws of the international community and of the NGOs. And finally, the most pernicious goal, although it may not have been explicitly pronounced, was to actually reintroduce with vigor Zionism is racism. And what better place to achieve all of that than in South Africa, in post-apartheid South Africa. And you and I were there. I served as the spokesman for the Jewish groups. I think there were about 25 groups and individuals who came, very committed. And in the middle of this whole mess, we called for a press conference. One of the reasons was different NGOs were allowed to put out their exhibitions for the other delegates and the media to see. And I wonder if you remember, and for those of you in the audience might recall, that the lawyers union of Egypt mounted this display of political cartoons that would have brought tears of joy to Goebbels and would have certainly made the pages of Der Stürmer. Every Jew, every Israeli leader was depicted as an animal. It's called animalization. And the screeds that were embedded there, the anti-Semitic emotions that were on display, this was not presented as an expose, but as a confirmation as to why this NGO and many others saw the Jewish people, saw Israel and Zionism as outside the realm of legitimacy. Our protest to the organizers that this exhibition and others violated the rules fell on deaf ears. When we called our press conference if you remember, the pitch of the rugby stadium in Durban, there were a few of us there. It was already been a tough week. There had been physical confrontations, there'd been verbal abuse, but we almost weren't prepared for a phalanx of Iranian women clad in black who rushed the press conference, tried to overturn the lectern, and try to destroy our one unified interaction with the media. I think there are two more experiences that really jump out. Friday morning, Erev Shabbat, many of us were going to go over and make our final arrangements to be at the Jewish Community Center. Any of us who was there, the Ir Miklat, the one place that we ran to each night, first of all, to get a kosher meal, and secondly, sometimes literally to cry on each other's shoulders and to sit down and to see what could still be done to counterattack and salvage the situation, was about 2 kilometers, just a couple of blocks from where Durban took place. And we would all walk over there for lunch or dinner, or some people would work there for hours. On Friday morning, the chief of police of Durban came over to me and said, look, you have to tell your people, and I have to beg you, do not try to go from the stadium to the Jewish Community Center. They said, well, why not? We've been doing it all week. So come with, we went up to a high spot in the stadium, and he showed me some of the 20,000 protesters who were brought in by trade unions by train to have a protest whose title was Zionism is Racism, with banner afloat, Hitler was right, with people giving out free copies of the Protocols of Zion and Mein Kampf. It was an absolutely horrific experience, and the police commander just said, I'm sorry, I cannot guarantee the safety of the members of the Jewish delegation right now. Please, if you can, have them stay in place until this passes. All of this took place under the banner of the United Nations, under the lead of the World Uniting Against Racism and Hate, and a law actually pulled off and orchestrated by our supposed comrades in the world of non-government organizations and human rights activism. It was a really crushing blow. And then finally, insofar as those first few days, the other event that sticks out is the Saturday night meeting to review, I think it was 2,500 pages at least, the final document as put together by the NGOs, which was supposed to be handed over to Mary Robinson, who would then present it at the governmental conference that was going to take place the second week. This document was and is an absolute disaster, a slander against our people. And really, 20 years later, you can go back and say that's where the current narrative against attacking Israel, Zionism, and Jewish people, of apartheid Israel, that's where all of this was first memorialized under the auspices of the guardians of the international community. One specific incident, and again, I hope those who were there, who were part of the conference, and those who are going to see this later on, will remember the key moment. By that time, many groups had left, understandably so. We stayed to monitor what was going on. And during the course of those few days, we did have opportunities to present on different topics, on tolerance, on defense of Israel, and especially on anti-Semitism. The Jewish groups worked mightily to actually get one paragraph in that massive tome that actually identified the problem of anti-Semitism and specifically condemned the attacks on Jewish synagogues in France. When they came to that section, the chair asked, there were about, 2,000 people under this massive tent, and there were mics around the audience. Does anyone have any comment on section 25? A woman stepped forward to the microphone. I saw her badge. She was from Nazareth, Israel, an Israeli Arab who was a delegate from the World Council of Churches. She held up the document and said, I see here that there's reference to anti-Semitism and attacks on synagogues. We're here at a world conference against racism. What does this have to do, any of this stuff have to do with racism? I move to strike, meaning to take it out from the final document. I remember a voice vote, people raised their hand. It was overwhelming that everyone was ready to, not only having finished kicking the Jews in the where for 5 days, but now to send a clear message to friend and foe alike that Jewish people need not apply to the civil society for any sympathy, concern, or activism against anti-Semitism. There were about 30 of us scattered among the 2,000 people there that evening. We didn't coordinate it, but when we heard the overwhelming vote to strike even that one reference to anti-Semitism and to the firebombing of synagogues, of shuls, we got up, unified without any previous signal, and we walked out. And I will remember forever the catcalls and whistles of our fellow human rights activists as we left that night. Those are my memories of the first week, and I hope it helps set the stage for a spirited discussion and presentation. And I just want to commend you, Anne, and other activists who've worked very, very hard to force some of the leading nations of the world to boycott Durban 4. But we all know that that golem is not yet dead. It'll continually be resurrected until the nations of the world finally say, we voted once to vacate Zionism is racism, and this entire process is illegitimate. Thank you.
Joel Pollak is a radio host and best-selling author. He currently serves as senior editor-at-large and in-house counsel at Breitbart News, where he worked alongside media pioneer Andrew Breitbart. He has published several books and ebooks and is a winner of the 2018 Robert Novak Journalism Alumni Fellowship. A graduate of Harvard Law School, he is originally from South Africa and attended the 2001 Durban conference as a journalist. Thank you for joining us, Joel.
Thanks, Anne. And it's really a privilege to be here. I think it's very important to mark the 20th anniversary of the efforts to protest the conference. I think those efforts were really, really important, even though they went somewhat unnoticed at the time. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But a little bit about my background. As Anne mentioned, I was born in South Africa. My parents immigrated to the United States when I was 8 weeks old. So I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. And I attended Harvard College. And I worked as an intern for a number of Democratic politicians, as well as participating in a variety of left-wing campus activist groups. I studied with Cornell West. I was very much on the left. And when I finished college, I won a Rotary Foundation ambassadorial scholarship, and I chose to go back to South Africa and explore the country where my family had roots. My family was never particularly political, although I did have a couple of cousins who were members of the underground African National Congress when it was the anti-apartheid movement. And I was very enthusiastic about the changes going on in South Africa at the time when Nelson Mandela was president, followed by Thabo Mbeki. So I viewed my scholarship in South Africa as a chance to see and experience those changes firsthand. But prior to that, I actually spent 6 months in Israel studying at a religious seminary. And I was very enthusiastic about the prospects of the peace process. This was 1999. Ehud Barak became prime minister of Israel on the day I arrived in Israel. And I spent many evenings discussing the prospect of peace, both with Jewish residents of Jerusalem and with Arab residents whom I would meet on my walk home. We used to encounter Palestinians, Jordanians, people who were coming to Jerusalem out of curiosity. There really was a feeling in the air that peace was going to break out any moment. I was in South Africa when the second Intifada exploded in September 2000. And although my sympathies were very much on the left and I was very much in favor of the peace process, I was shocked by the reception that the breakdown of the peace process received in South Africa. It was unlike anything I'd been exposed to in the United States. And there were many South Africans, particularly, but not exclusively in the Muslim community, who welcomed the end of the peace process and instantly blamed Israel. And as the suicide bombings began to unfold, as the terrorism began to accelerate, that didn't stop. There was this drumbeat of support for the Palestinians versus the Israelis, and very little support for the Israelis, at least within elite opinion and within government circles in South Africa. That shocked me a bit, but I didn't really think that the left position on Israel was irredeemable. In fact, I became involved in a number of interfaith activities. I became involved in some political discussions aimed at trying to establish dialogue or use the South African example of peacemaking to bring to the Middle East. And at one stage, I even moved into a house that I shared with a Muslim family. I was boarding with a Muslim family. And although at the time I wasn't openly Orthodox, I was observant. They knew I was Jewish. I went to services every Friday night and so forth. So I was really, really intensely involved in efforts to reach out to the other side of the argument and understand it. At that time, I also finished my studies and started to work as a writer, as a freelance journalist. I began to seek work. And one of the first publications to hire me was a left-wing publication called Color Lines. I was a freelancer, so I wasn't on the payroll, but they paid me to write articles about South Africa, and I was assigned to cover the 2001 UN Conference Against Racism in Durban. And there was actually a delegation from Color Lines that came out to the conference. The American left had a very strong interest in the racism conference for a specific reason and for a general reason. The specific reason was the issue of reparations, which has continued to come up on the left in American politics. And there was some idea of getting reparations out of this conference. The other general area of interest was in South Africa. People wanted to see the new South Africa. People wanted to experience it in this context. Remember, of course, the early conferences against racism in the 1980s had been called partly to rally support against the apartheid regime. So hosting the conference in South Africa, in Durban, was meant to send a signal that South Africa had arrived, and it was meant to showcase South Africa's transformation. All of this was hijacked by the effort to turn the racism conference into an anti-Israel forum. And the writing was already on the wall. There was a preliminary meeting in Tehran and so forth. But I went to the conference fresh out of having had these experiences of speaking with Muslim communities, with religious leaders, participating in interfaith dialogue. And I approached my assignment to cover the conference in that spirit. When I arrived in Durban, I was shocked by what I saw. And what had happened was the Jewish community organizations had pulled out of the conference. Many had wanted to participate because of discussions about anti-Semitism as a form of racism. But they pulled out when they saw the agenda of the conference was going to be about Israel, and in a specifically demonizing way, to the point where Israel was being singled out in what you can call an anti-Semitic way. So Jewish organizations were pulling out. What happened was the NGO forum, which preceded the conference, was dominated by protests by anti-Israel groups. And those protests crossed the boundary into anti-Semitic language and rhetoric. I'll never forget, there was a booth there that was run by an Egyptian cartoonist. And he was churning out cartoons that could have come from Nazi publications in Germany in the 1930s. They depicted stereotypical Jews doing horrible things, and these were eventually condemned by Mary Robinson, who was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, once they were brought to her attention. But these were circulating freely within the conference, and nobody was condemning them, nobody was singling them out. It actually took Jewish activists, I believe, to get these to Mary Robinson, where she eventually said something about them. But this was just one aspect of the anti-Semitism that I saw there. Every day in the middle of a square that had been set up for people to hold demonstrations, there were these intense confrontations between the anti-Israel demonstrators, who in some cases were carrying anti-Semitic signs, distributing anti-Semitic literature, confrontations between that loud and vociferous group and a very small group of pro-Israel student activists who had decided to stay at the conference when the Jewish community institutions had pulled out. And these young activists, with incredible bravery, stood up to a crowd that was easily 10 times the size of the pro-Israel crowd. And they did so peacefully in the best tradition of nonviolent protest. At one stage, they bought buckets of flowers and they tried handing flowers to the anti-Israel demonstrators. These were angrily refused in most cases. And they created these visuals of the confrontation that reminded the world, at least those who wished to see, and there were newswire photographs of these confrontations, they reminded the world that there were two sides to the issue. Otherwise, the narrative coming out of Durban was intended to be entirely that Israel was the new apartheid state, but worse than that, that Jews, through their sentimental attachment to Israel, were aiding and abetting apartheid. There was an effort by Islamist organizations, specifically Islamist organizations, to describe Israel as being offensive to Jews. And to that end, they enlisted the help of Neturei Karta, which is a fringe organization of ultra-Orthodox Jews who reject the existence of the state of Israel. And they sent 3 or 4 guys who dressed in black coats and black hats, which are recognized by the outside world as sort of stereotypical Jewish garb. I'm an observant Jew. I don't dress like that. There are other Jews who do it. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about your political views, but they brought these Jews in to attack and demonize Israel. And they made sure that these guys were in front of every anti-Israel demonstration. The international media loved it. They photographed these stereotypical Jewish characters in front of signs saying things like, "Real Jews reject Israel." And that became part of the narrative. The young Jewish activists, who included a contingent from Israel that also had some Ethiopian Jews among them, they were the only force creating alternative visual imagery. And I covered that and I watched that, and I was stunned by these confrontations. I was impressed by the bravery of the Jewish activists. But what really settled it for me And keep in mind, I'm still on the left, so I'm trying to process how this could possibly be happening. What really settled the issue for me that this conference was anti-Semitic were two events. One was when there was a specific discussion about anti-Semitism, a breakout meeting about anti-Semitism that was broken up by anti-Israel demonstrators. They would not even allow a discussion of anti-Semitism that had nothing to do with Israel. So the people who hated Israel would not allow hatred against Jews to be discussed. They broke up that meeting. Now, eventually there were some side conversations that continued afterward, but they stopped any discussion of anti-Semitism. The other thing that happened was that there was a very large demonstration on the Friday of the NGO forum, which I think may have been the first day of the actual conference of the participants of the nations that came to the conference. Maybe it was the day before, but in any event, it was at the end of the NGO portion. That Friday, there was a demonstration in Durban outside the conference of 15,000 anti-Israel demonstrators. And they were absolutely vitriolic in their hatred of Israel. They carried pictures or depictions of the Star of David dripping with blood, for example. I was standing along the parade route, taking photographs and taking it all in, trying to write about it. And a man walked up to me holding a book with a swastika on the cover. And he was trying to make the case that Israel is the new Nazi Germany, but literally distributing swastikas alongside this march. Now, I'm a person at the time on the left, involved in interfaith dialogue, believing sincerely in the resumption of the peace process at some stage. I'm living with a Muslim family at the time. I had a sincere belief that through dialogue, we could get somewhere, that we could reach some kind of understanding. And I stood on the side of this parade and I watched the 15,000 angry people walk by, yelling death to Israel, Allahu Akbar, and that sort of thing, with crowds of local activists, Black South Africans who really didn't have a direct connection to the Middle East, but who had been, in a sense, recruited to the cause, and these phony rabbis who were marched in the front of all this. And I'm watching this massive crowd go by and thinking, there's no way I can ever have a dialogue with all of these people. The world of people who hate Israel is so massive that there is no room for dialogue. They do not want a dialogue with someone like me. They just don't want it. They don't want to talk about anti-Semitism. They don't want to respect Jews' right to exist as Jews, even absent any discussion of Israel. And it was completely shocking to me. Another shocking thing that happened around the same time was I was sitting with my American colleagues from Color Lines, from the Left Wing magazine, and I pointed to one of the posters that had a Star of David dripping with blood. And I was trying to point out that I found this anti-Semitic. And I'll never forget the response. One of the editors told me that it wasn't anti-Semitic, that the Star of David was a national symbol, and it was Israel's own fault if people used it in nasty depictions of Israel because they put a religious symbol on their flag. That's what you can expect if you put a religious symbol on your flag. Of course, nobody would have thought to do that to the Turkish flag or even to the Union Jack or any flag that has any kind of cross on it. This was specifically an anti-Semitic symbol, and my colleagues from the United States couldn't see that. That wasn't true of every American. One thing I did take a lot of heart in was the fact that when some of the Jewish activists arrived with boxes of T-shirts saying, stop hate, not Jews, or something to that effect, telling people to distinguish, or stop racism, not Jews, something distinguishing between the various messages at the conference, but expressing support for Jews, a number of Black American activists took the T-shirts very happily. They agreed with that message. There was enough of a familiarity with some of the African American activists at the conference with Israel's cause, with the reason for an Israel. There was enough empathy. There was some crossover there between pro-Israel activists from all over the world and a small number of African American activists who really felt that their issues were being sidelined by this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic hatred, and they wanted to show solidarity with Jews and with Israel. So that was quite touching to me and quite moving at the time. But I remember just being completely shocked by the experience. And that Friday night, the very small Durban Jewish community held a Shabbat dinner, a Sabbath evening dinner, for the people who were still in town after the Jewish organizations pulled out. And I remember being at that dinner, and there were several tables of people who had stood up to this hatred all week long, who had risked their physical safety, who had subjected themselves to all kinds of abuse and placed themselves in harm's way, and who were confronted, as I was, with the sudden realization that people whom you liked and respected and admired in other contexts hated you, or at least were completely silent when it came to others hating you and wouldn't defend you. And there was this atmosphere of camaraderie, but almost like we had survived a battle. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, and really nothing I've experienced since. So what happened to me after that conference was I really began to see that there was no interest in dialogue on the left, that at bottom, this was about erasing Israel, and not just erasing Israel, but being willing to erase Jews, essentially. You couldn't discuss anti-Semitism within the framework of the Conference Against Racism. Jews were excluded from this conversation entirely. Now, it took me some time still to wrestle with some of my own political views, and I was still involved in dialogues and that sort of thing. But the effort that went out of that conference, the boycott, divestment, sanctions effort that proceeded and was founded based on this false Israel apartheid analogy, was something that the activists had hoped to take forward in a very dramatic way after the conference. The only thing that really slowed them down was the fact that September 11th happened about a week later. And September 11th brought home to many people who were otherwise uninterested just how serious the threat of terrorism was, that it wasn't just something that happened to Israelis or Jews because somehow they deserved it for living there or being there or supporting Israel. This was something that could happen to anybody. And so it really set back the BDS cause for a while, because the case for fighting terror suddenly became very real, very visceral to a lot of people. But what I discovered over time was that there was very little interest in dialogue toward a peaceful two-state solution, that the dominant theme on the left, even people who believed they themselves meant well, the dominant theme was erasure of Israel and indifference at best to the fate of Jews. And the one question that always unravels my friends or classmates, I first discovered this at law school more than a decade ago, but the question that unravels the arguments of pro-Palestinian advocates who are well-meaning, let's say, who don't have any other connection to the conflict, people who are not Arab, Muslim, Jewish, Israeli, whatever, people who just believe this is about social justice. I would ask colleagues and friends, what kind of Palestinian state do you want to build? Is it a state that bans racial discrimination? Is it a state that bans religious discrimination? Is it a state where Jews can live and practice the Jewish faith freely? And they can't answer that question, even if they might say that's something they want to see. They know that there's no force within Palestinian society or politics that's advocating that at all or exemplifying it in any way. And that's what I saw in Durban in 2001, that there just was no concern whatsoever for Jews within the framework of this discussion. And it began for me a long process of questioning some of my views on the left, and I became much more conservative over time. But whether your views are left-wing or right-wing on any other political issue or in any other context, what Durban really settles once and forevermore is that the case against Israel is a case against Jews. It's a case that has no room for the protection of Jews, for the existence of Jews even, because Israel is a shield for Jewish communities around the world, not just in a physical sense, but the fact that it exists means that Jews can live with some greater sense of security, that Jews can prosper, that Jews can be proud of who they are, of who we are. And that's something that the so-called anti-racists simply do not understand. These forums, these gatherings, these conferences are not the solution to racism. They are not the solution to discrimination. They've become the foundation for racism and discrimination. They've become the platform for it, just as the World Conference Against Racism in Durban became the platform for anti-Semitism. I came there as somebody with family members who'd participated in the anti-apartheid struggle. I wanted to see the new South Africa. I was very enthusiastic about it. I was enthusiastic about the peace process. I was living with a Muslim family, and I still have very close connections with friends in the Muslim community. But the anti-Israel movement has no place for those kinds of ordinary interactions. You have to give up your willingness to exist as a Jew, as a free person, if you want to participate in any way in their dialogue. And that's just a price that we should never be asked to pay again, but that's what's being demanded of us. And that's why the Durban Conference continues to be a travesty. And it's a travesty that the United Nations continues to commemorate that event as if it's something to be proud of. It's something that should be mourned, the way the Olympic Committee mourns the 1972 Munich massacre of Israeli athletes. This is a dark stain on the history of the United Nations. And to the extent that we commemorate Durban, we should commemorate the bravery of the activists who actually stood up against anti-Semitic hatred, who stood for real solutions to racism, the people who came there with good intentions, the people who with bravery opposed some of this horrible rhetoric that was being circulated and condoned by the United Nations. That's what we should celebrate, the bravery of the people in that room on Friday night and the solidarity of some of the African-American activists who stood with us. But the World Conference Against Racism is and remains a disgrace. It was and remains a disgrace.
It was late into the night when they adopted the final declaration. He wouldn't condemn the NGO statement.
We are not going to denounce their documents. On the contrary, we appreciate their work.